I still remember the way the living room light fell across their faces that afternoon. A soft, warm glow, touching the edges of the moment that would carve itself into my memory like a quiet wound. The house smelled of chamomile tea and the faint sweetness of the banana bread I had baked earlier that morning, hoping it might make the visit feel warm, familiar, safe. My grandson's tiny shoes sat neatly by the front door, where I had placed them, after helping him pull them off. His giggles still echoing faintly in my mind, even though he was now napping in the guest room with his small hand curled around the edge of his blanket. I had just sat down in my favorite armchair when my son and his wife exchanged a glance so sharp and deliberate it sliced through the atmosphere before a single word was spoken. It was one of those glances that makes a mother's heart tighten instinctively, sensing something unspoken, something heavy, something gathering in the air like a quiet storm. My son cleared his throat first, looking at me with a tightness around his eyes that I had not seen when he first arrived. His wife sat beside him, her legs crossed, her posture rigid, her fingers tapping impatiently against her knee. I noticed everything: the flicker of impatience on her face, the discomfort in his shoulders, the tension stretching between them like a thin wire ready to snap. I felt a chill trace down my spine, even though the room was warm. There was something coming, something they had rehearsed, something they needed to say together because neither one wanted to carry the weight of it alone. So I waited in the stillness, hands folded in my lap, heart slowing into that strange, heavy rhythm that mothers know too well, the rhythm that anticipates hurt long before it spills out in words. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, too careful, the kind of voice people use when trying to disguise the sting inside the message they are about to deliver. He said they had been talking. He said they had realized some things. He said they appreciated everything I had done. Every word felt like the preface to a blow. My daughter-in-law leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with a kind of firm certainty that made me feel suddenly much smaller in my own home. She reached for his hand not out of comfort but out of control, needing to guide him through the script they had practiced. And then she looked directly at me, her expression smooth, almost cold, and she spoke the words that would stay with me long after the conversation was over. "You're too old to babysit. We don't trust you anymore." For a moment, I genuinely could not understand what I had heard. The words floated in the air between us, heavy and sharp, falling into the quiet room like pieces of glass. My breath caught in my throat, my fingers stiffened on my lap, and I felt the world tilt slightly as if everything inside me had shifted its weight at once. There was no kindness in her expression, no softness in her tone. It was a judgment delivered with casual certainty, a decision already made, a verdict without possibility of appeal. My son did not correct her. He did not soften her words. He simply looked down at his hands and nodded as if this truth had always been obvious, as if I were suddenly fragile and untrustworthy, as if the years I had spent raising him had dissolved into irrelevance. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There was a silence heavy enough to press against my chest, heavy enough to make my throat tighten with all the words I could not find. My mind raced to understand the accusation, the reason, the fear behind it. I thought of every moment I had spent caring for my grandson, every soft morning feeding him oatmeal. While he babbled stories, only I understood every afternoon spent building towers of wooden blocks that he gleefully knocked down. Every evening when he curled into my lap with his tiny body warm and trusting. I thought of how safe he always was with me, how deeply I cherished every moment of watching him grow, how much it meant to feel needed again, even in the smallest ways. And then I thought of the day my hands trembled while buttoning his tiny sweater, a tremble subtle enough that I had laughed it off, telling myself it was just fatigue. My daughter-in-law had noticed. I knew she had. I remembered the way her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. I remembered how she had gently but firmly guided me aside to finish dressing him herself. I remembered the moment she decided I was no longer dependable. To her, I was becoming a liability, an inconvenience. A risk. I forced myself to breathe slowly, deeply, trying to gather pieces of composure from the fragments scattered in my chest. I asked them why. Why now? Why this? My voice came out small, thinner than it used to be, and for the first time I heard the age in it, the fragility that had slowly crept in over the years. My son looked up at me then, guilt flickering in his expression like a candle struggling to stay lit. He said it was because I seemed tired lately. He said I seemed forgetful. He said I moved slower. He said he worried I might miss something important. But his eyes drifted to his wife each time he spoke, seeking her approval, leaning on her certainty rather than his own memories of me. His wife cut in again before I could respond. She said it was not personal. She said they just needed someone more reliable. She said they could not risk anything happening to their child. And even though she spoke calmly, even though her tone pretended to be reasonable, every word felt like another small fracture widening inside me. She did not see me as a grandmother. She saw me as a burden. A fading presence, a mistake waiting to happen. I felt tears forming but held them back with every ounce of strength I had left. I refused to cry in front of her. I refused to crumble in the face of her judgment. So I sat there, nodding slowly, swallowing the humiliation like something sharp that scraped its way down my throat. I understood their words, but I did not believe their reasoning. I knew there was something deeper beneath her accusations, something unspoken, something she didn't want revealed. It wasn't my age that frightened her. It wasn't my pace or my hands. It was something else. Something she didn't trust. Something she hid behind the armor of her firmness. When they stood to leave, my grandson still slept peacefully in the guest room. My son lifted him with gentle care, brushing his tiny curls away from his forehead. I reached out and touched the back of his small hand one last time before they left, feeling the warmth of his skin, the softness of his fingers, the weight of everything I was losing. My daughter-in-law watched me closely, as if making sure I didn't hold on too long, as if my very touch carried danger. They walked out of the door shortly after, leaving the smell of chamomile tea and banana bread lingering in the air like a bittersweet echo. The silence that filled the house once they were gone felt different than usual. It was not peaceful. It was not gentle. It was sharp, heavy, jagged with hurt. I stood in the doorway long after their car disappeared down the street, my hands trembling, my breath unsteady, my heart aching with a kind of humiliation I had never thought my own child would allow. But beneath the hurt, beneath the humiliation, beneath the ache of being dismissed, another feeling quietly stirred. A feeling I did not yet have words for. Something was wrong, not with me, but with something in their home. Something in their life that made her fearful enough to project her terror onto me. And 1 week later, they would finally understand. 1 week later, they would realize who they should have been worried about. And it was not me. The house felt impossibly still after they left, the kind of stillness that settles not from peace, but from something ruptured, something torn quietly beneath the surface. I walked through the rooms, slowly touching the back of the chair where my son had sat, smoothing the blanket on the guest bed, where my grandson had slept only minutes before running my fingertips along the edge of the kitchen counter, where my daughter-in-law had stood with her arms crossed, delivering her verdict with the cold confidence of someone who believed she was protecting her own. The silence followed me like a shadow, clinging tightly to every movement as if refusing to let me forget what had just happened. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the sting of their words and were now holding it inside their plaster bones. I made myself a cup of tea, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something warm to hold, something that anchored me, something that kept my hands busy so they wouldn't tremble. As I stirred the spoon slowly, watching the tea swirl into dark amber, the humiliation settled deeper into my chest, creating a kind of pressure I couldn't quite breathe around. For years, I had believed that aging gracefully meant learning to accept the limitations of my own body, learning to move slower without apologizing for it, learning to listen more than speak. But I had never prepared myself for the moment when my own child would question my worth because of it. I had never imagined hearing those words spoken so casually in my own home. "You're too old. We don't trust you anymore." The sentence repeated itself over and over in my mind, replaying with the cruel clarity of a knife glinting in light. It wasn't only the accusation that hurt. It was the certainty behind it, the decision, the way they had come here not to discuss but to inform. The way my daughter-in-law had looked at me as if I were a fragile thing, as if one misstep, one slow movement, one moment of fatigue could shatter everything. I felt my cheeks burn again, remembering the way she watched me button the sweater last week, her eyes sharp and assessing, her lips pressed tightly together. I had seen judgment in her expression before, but this was something else entirely. This was suspicion. This was warning. This was fear. But fear of what? Certainly not of me. I had cared for their child countless times without incident, without complaint, without asking for anything in return except the joy of being close to him, the joy of feeling needed again. I had been gentle. I had been present. I had been vigilant, and yet something in her eyes today had nothing to do with my abilities. It had everything to do with something she was hiding. I sat down at the kitchen table, wrapping both hands around the warm cup and letting the heat seep into my palms. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to quiet the thoughts swirling through my mind. But the silence only amplified them. The image of her tapping her fingers against her knee, the quick glances she exchanged with my son, the tension that settled into her shoulders like someone bracing for impact, the way she held their child close to her chest when they left, as if shielding him from something invisible. I replayed each detail slowly, carefully, like a mother rewinding a memory she knows contains a truth hidden beneath its surface. I tried to tell myself it was simply exhaustion on her part. Stress. Parenthood had never been gentle. Perhaps she was overwhelmed. Perhaps she simply wanted control. But the more I examined the memory, the more something felt wrong. Not wrong in the way of conflict or tension or dislike. Wrong in the way of fear. Real fear. The kind that comes from watching something crumble around you while pretending everything is fine. I stood and walked to the living room, picking up the small toy car my grandson had dropped earlier that day. I held it in my hands, feeling the smooth plastic edges, imagining his little fingers gripping it tightly as he dragged it across the floor. I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of longing and unease. Something was happening in their home, something she was afraid of but couldn't admit, something she was projecting onto me because acknowledging the real source would mean facing a truth she didn't want to see. I didn't know what it was yet, but the instinct that had lived inside me since the day I became a mother stirred with fierce certainty. They trusted the wrong person. Not me, someone else. I placed the toy gently back onto the shelf and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside to stare out at the street. The late afternoon sunlight bathed the neighborhood in a warm glow, children riding bikes, neighbors chatting, the slow hum of life unfolding as usual. But inside my chest, an uneasy pulse echoed. I couldn't explain it, but I knew the moment they took him away earlier, something in the air had shifted. Something beyond humiliation, something beyond hurt. A warning. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay awake listening to the creaks of the house settling, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog. My thoughts circled back to my daughter-in-law again and again. Her sharpness, her defensiveness, her need to control every detail, her refusal to let anyone else care for her child. I had always sensed something brittle in her, something guarded. But today her fear had been loud enough to cut through the calm mask she usually wore. Loud enough for me to feel it in my bones. Was she afraid something would happen to the child? Or was she afraid someone would see something she was trying to hide? The next morning, the house felt colder, as if the air carried the faint echo of their words. I made breakfast, but only picked at it. My appetite had slipped away somewhere between regret and confusion. I cleaned the kitchen, tidied the living room, watered the plants, but my mind never settled. Each movement felt like an attempt to push back the unease, to smooth out the jagged edges of yesterday, but the feeling only grew. I reached for my phone several times, tempted to call my son, to ask him to come back, to ask if everything was truly fine. But I stopped myself every time. If I asked him, he would deny it. If I pressed, she would become defensive. The truth lay buried beneath layers of fear and pride, and I would need to wait for it to reveal itself. In the late afternoon, while I was folding laundry, my phone buzzed. I felt a flicker of hope that it might be my son reaching out, perhaps rethinking the harshness of yesterday's conversation. But when I picked up the phone, it was a short message from my daughter-in-law. "We'll pick up the stroller later. Please have it ready." No greeting. No warmth, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just a request, a command almost, and beneath the cold sharpness of her words, I sensed something else. Something rushed, something stressed, something she was trying to keep tightly under control. I typed a simple response and placed the phone down, my heart beating unevenly as I tried to shake the feeling crawling up my spine. I continued folding clothes, smoothing out wrinkles that didn't matter, refolding towels I had already folded perfectly. The hours dragged on until the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, my daughter-in-law stood there alone. Her face looked tired, the skin under her eyes slightly darkened, her lips pressed into a thin line. She barely met my gaze as she hurried past me, heading straight for the hall closet. I watched her silently. Her movements were fast but tense, not rushed with purpose but rushed with anxiety. She pulled out the stroller, fumbling slightly with the wheels. Her hands shook. Not enough for someone else to notice, but I noticed. I noticed everything. She avoided looking at me, but I could feel her eyes flick back toward the car parked outside more than once. Her movements grew sharper as if she was racing against something I couldn't see. When she finally turned toward the door with the stroller in hand, her gaze brushed mine for only a moment. And in that moment, I saw it clearly. Fear. A fear that had nothing to do with my age or my ability to babysit. A fear she could not admit aloud. Before she could rush outside, I asked gently if everything was all right. Her entire body stiffened. Her breath caught. And without looking at me, she forced out a strained yes, followed by a clipped goodbye before hurrying out the door. I stood there long after she left, staring at the empty space she had rushed through, feeling the cold air from outside brush against my skin. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. And somehow, I knew their child's safety had nothing to do with me. It had everything to do with someone inside their home, someone she was terrified of. And 1 week later, that truth would shatter everything they believed. For 2 days after she rushed out of my doorway with that stroller, rattling awkwardly behind her, the unease inside me grew into something heavier, something so persistent that it seemed to breathe alongside me. I tried to shake it off as nerves, as overthinking, as leftover humiliation from their cruel accusation, but the feeling refused to loosen its grip. It settled into the corners of each room, lingered in the quiet moments between tasks, pressed itself against the back of my thoughts until I could no longer dismiss it as imagination. Something was happening in their home, something that made her tremble, something that made her eyes dart toward the car like she expected someone to appear, something that turned her words sharp and brittle, as if she spoke through clenched fear. I considered calling my son just to hear his voice, to listen for any crack in his tone that might reveal the truth, but I hesitated each time my hand hovered over the phone. He trusted his wife completely. He had aligned himself with her judgments so quickly that night in my living room, nodding when she dismissed me, accepting her certainty without pausing to question whether it was fair. He would not hear me now. He would defend her. He would dismiss my instincts as worry or age or imagination. He would tell me I was reading too much into things, that everything was fine, that I needed to rest, that I needed to stop being dramatic. I knew his voice too well. I knew when he carried his own convictions and when he carried hers. So I waited. On the third day, the waiting became unbearable. The silence was too loud, too sharp, too full of unanswered questions. I found myself pacing through the kitchen, wiping the same counter twice, then 3 times, as if scrubbing its smooth surface could cleanse the ache curling beneath my ribs. I tried to distract myself with chores I usually enjoyed, but every small task felt hollow, disconnected from the world beyond my walls. My grandson's absence weighed heavily on me, not just because I missed him, but because I could not shake the image of him being held too tightly by a mother who was terrified of something she refused to name. In the afternoon, I finally gave in and picked up my phone. My hands trembled slightly as I typed a simple message to my son, asking how things were and if everything was all right. I forced myself to keep the words neutral, gentle, careful not to reveal the fear that had woven itself into my voice. I waited for his reply with my heart thudding uneasily. When his message finally arrived, it was short. Too short. He said everything was fine. He said they were busy. He said he would call soon. The words were clean and effortless, polished like stones smoothed by a river, but the tone felt wrong, detached, cold, as if he was reciting a rehearsed line, as if he was covering something, as if he was deliberately keeping me on the edges of their world. I stared at the message, reading it 3, then 4 times, trying to dissect its simplicity. Something about the way he had written fine made my stomach twist. It was the same tone he had used in the past when brushing me aside, when hiding stress, when avoiding confrontation. But beneath that tone lay something else now, something jagged, something anxious, something that felt more like a warning than reassurance. I typed back that I loved them and that I was here if they needed anything. He responded with a heart emoji, a soft dismissal disguised as affection, a familiar way of ending a conversation quickly. That night I could not sleep. I lay awake listening to the faint hum of cars passing outside, the shifts of wood inside the walls, the sighing wind brushing against the trees. My mind kept returning to the way my daughter-in-law had avoided my eyes, the trembling of her hands, the stiffness in her posture, the way she had clutched the stroller like it was a shield. Her silence was not the silence of anger anymore. It was the silence of someone carrying a secret too heavy to hold alone. The next morning I woke with a heaviness pressing hard against my chest. I made myself tea and sat by the window, letting the early light spill across the floor in soft gold lines. The house felt colder than usual. Or perhaps it was I who felt colder, sensing something in the air that had not yet revealed its face. I set the tea down and reached for the small photo frame on the side table, the one with my grandson smiling at the camera, his eyes bright, his cheeks full, his tiny teeth showing in a crooked grin. I traced the outline of his face with my fingertip, feeling a fiercely protective warmth bloom inside my chest. I knew something was wrong, not with me, not with my age, not with my hands, but with something in their home. I stood suddenly, moved by an urgency I could no longer ignore. I grabbed my coat and keys and stepped outside, the crisp morning air hitting my face like a jolt. I didn't know exactly what I intended to do. I only knew I couldn't sit still any longer while fear grew quietly beneath their roof. I drove to their neighborhood slowly, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. With each turn, my heart beat faster, my breath becoming shallower as worry dug deeper into my bones. When I reached their street, I parked a few houses away, unsure if I should knock on the door unannounced. The car engine ticked softly as it cooled, the sound mingling with the rustle of wind through the trees. Their house sat quiet, the curtains drawn, the yard still. There was no sign of life, no sound of movement, no laughter, no crying, no car in the driveway. A hollow feeling settled inside me. I sat in the car for several minutes, uncertainty locking my limbs in place. Would they be angry if they saw me? Would they accuse me of interfering? Would she glare at me again with that look of suspicion and fear? But beneath all of that uncertainty lived something stronger. Instinct, a mother's instinct, a grandmother's instinct. The kind that warns you when danger has slipped into the spaces around those you love. I stepped out of the car slowly, taking a few quiet breaths before walking toward their house. The gravel crunched beneath my feet in a rhythm that felt too loud in the silent morning. I reached their front steps and hesitated, listening. Nothing, no voices, no movement. The quiet pressed in around me, thick and heavy. I rang the doorbell. The sound echoed through the house, but no one answered. I rang again, still nothing. I pressed my ear gently against the door, straining to hear any sign of life. My pulse beat hard enough to blur the edges of my vision. As I stood there, suspended in fear, a sudden noise broke the silence behind me. A car engine turning onto the street. I turned quickly and saw their car approaching, my son behind the wheel, his wife in the passenger seat, my grandson in the back. But it was their faces that made the breath leave my lungs. My son looked pale, his expression drawn tight with exhaustion, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles pulsing. My daughter-in-law looked worse. Her eyes were red, swollen from crying. Her hair was messy, her face streaked with dried tears. She clutched her hands in her lap as if she were bracing herself for impact. And my grandson sat silently behind them, not smiling, not moving, his little body pressed into the car seat with a stillness that broke something inside me. When they saw me standing there, my son's expression shifted from surprise to a strange mixture of relief and despair, as if seeing me was both a comfort and a confirmation of something terrible. He parked abruptly, opened the door, and hurried toward me. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking in a way I had not heard since he was a child. I waited. He swallowed hard and looked back at his wife, who was now crying silently into her hands. "There's something we need to tell you." His voice trembled. "And it has nothing to do with your age." My son stood there on the walkway, his breath uneven, his eyes shining with a fear that did not belong to the confident man he had always tried to be. The wind brushed past us with an unseasonably sharp chill, rustling the leaves in a way that made the whole street feel unsettled, as if even the air sensed the way the moment trembled beneath its own weight. My daughter-in-law had not stepped out of the car. She sat in the passenger seat motionless, her face crumpled in on itself, her fingers pressed tightly to her temples as if trying to hold her thoughts together before they spilled out in panic. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. My grandson remained silent in the back seat, his small eyes watching everything with the stunned confusion only a toddler could have, sensing tension without understanding it. When my son finally forced out words again, his voice cracked open in a way I had not heard in decades. Not since the night he crawled into my bed as a boy crying from a nightmare. He said my name first, not mom, but my actual name, as if he needed to anchor himself in formality before unraveling. He said there had been signs. He said they had ignored them. He said they thought it would pass. He said they thought they could handle it on their own. Each sentence stumbled out half formed, like his thoughts were trying to escape faster than his tongue could shape them. And then he fell into silence again, pressing a trembling hand to his forehead. I stepped closer, feeling my heart thudding in a strange rhythm that was not fear exactly, but something deeper, something instinctive, something ancient within me waking to attention. I reached out and placed a hand on his arm. He flinched, not away from me, but as if the touch itself jolted him back into the present. He took a shaky breath and looked toward the car, toward his wife. She lifted her head then, her eyes swollen and bloodshot, her cheeks streaked with the salt of dried tears. When she met my gaze, I saw something I had not expected. Not accusation, not resentment, not coldness, I saw terror. She opened the car door slowly, her legs trembling when she stepped out, her entire body folding inward like she was trying to disappear under the weight of her own secrets. When she tried to speak, her voice caught on the first syllable, breaking like a thin glass under pressure. She covered her mouth with her hand and shook her head as if the truth were too heavy to speak aloud. My son stepped toward her, placing a hand on her back, guiding her gently toward the walkway. They stood together in front of me, united not in judgment now, but in shared fear, shared confusion, shared desperation. She finally forced the words out. "It's me." Her voice was so fragile I almost didn't hear it at first. "I'm the one you should be worried about." The air stopped moving. For a moment I felt everything inside me freeze, as if the world had been suspended mid-breath. She continued speaking, but her words came in pieces, scattered fragments of a confession that had been caged inside her far too long. She said she hadn't been sleeping. She said she had been forgetting things, important things, dangerous things. She said she had moments when the world felt blurry, when her thoughts slipped away, when reality shifted, when she found herself standing in a room with no memory of how she had arrived. She said she had been scared to be alone with her own mind. My son's jaw tightened as he added that she had wandered out of the house one evening without realizing it, standing barefoot in the driveway with their child still inside asleep. She looked down at her hands as if they were foreign to her. She said she didn't remember leaving the house. She didn't remember unlocking the door. She didn't remember anything except waking up to headlights turning slowly onto their street and realizing she was standing in the cold with no coat, no shoes, no awareness of time. I felt a shiver crawl through my spine, a shiver of realization, a shiver of recognition. This was not the story they had come to my house to tell. This was not a confession they had intended to share. Something had happened since then, something undeniable. Something terrifying enough that they could no longer hide behind pride or excuses or control. I asked them why they had never told me, why they had come to my home and accused me instead, why they let me believe the doubt and humiliation belonged to me. And the answer fell from their lips with the kind of sorrow that comes from regrets that have ripened too long, because we thought it was safer to blame you than admit the truth. Her voice cracked again. She said she had been terrified that I would notice something was wrong with her. Terrified that I would see her trembling hands, her unfocused eyes, the way panic rose in her chest whenever she was left alone with the child. She said she didn't want me to know how unstable she felt. She said she didn't want anyone to see how her mind was slipping. She said she was so desperate to seem like the perfect mother that she turned her fear outward and placed it on me. The words pierced me in a way I had not been prepared for, not because of the accusation, but because I suddenly understood the fear in her eyes the day she rushed through my hallway, the panic in her movements, the trembling in her voice. The way she clung to the stroller as if it were the last piece of herself she could control. She started crying harder then, collapsing into my son's arms, her body shaking, her breath short and gasping. My son held her tightly, tears pooling in his eyes, his own composure cracking under the weight of the truth they had tried so hard to hide. He looked at me with a rawness I hadn't seen since he was a little boy and whispered that he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to help her. He didn't know how to protect their child without breaking her heart. He didn't know how to carry the burden of her unraveling mind on his own. I stepped closer, gathering every ounce of strength inside me, every instinct that motherhood had carved deep into my bones. I placed my hand on his shoulder and then reached gently for hers. Her skin was cold beneath my touch, trembling with silent fear. I told them both that we would figure it out, not as a daughter in law and a mother in law locked in silent tension, not as a son torn between his wife and his mother, but as a family, because something inside me knew the truth with fierce clarity. This was not her fault. This was not neglect. This was something deeper, something creeping slowly into her mind like a shadow slipping beneath a closed door. She swayed slightly as she stood, exhaustion pulling at her limbs, and then she said something that made my breath catch. "I don't trust myself anymore." Her voice broke completely then, dissolving into sobs she could no longer hold back. My son wrapped both arms around her, and I gently placed my hand on her back, feeling the trembling of her fragile body beneath my palm. I whispered that she was not alone. I whispered that we would keep the child safe. I whispered that she did not need to hide anymore. And as I said it, her harsh words from a week earlier echoed through my mind in a different light. "You're too old to babysit. We don't trust you anymore." She hadn't been protecting their child from me. She had been trying to protect their child from herself. But what neither of them realized yet was that her fear wasn't the only danger. Something else was happening around them. Something she hadn't seen. Something my son hadn't noticed. Something lurking in that house, threaded through the cracks of their routine, waiting for one moment of distraction. And soon, we would all understand that the danger she feared inside herself was only the beginning, because there was someone else they should have been worried about. And that truth would reveal itself in a way none of us could have expected. The drive back to my house after that conversation felt strangely unreal, as if the world around me had softened at the edges, blurring into muted colors that refused to settle. My son had insisted on following me home to make sure I arrived safely, even though I had driven myself for years without trouble. It was the first moment in a long time where I sensed a shift inside him, a flicker of concern that felt genuine rather than forced. His wife sat silently in the passenger seat beside him, her face pale and worn, her hands gripping her sleeves as if the fabric itself were the only thing keeping her grounded. My grandson's face was pressed against the window in the back, watching the passing houses with a stillness that unsettled me, the kind of stillness that belongs to children who absorb tension with the same ease they absorb sunlight. When they finally parked behind me and walked me to my door, there was no dismissiveness in my daughter in law's eyes, no sharpness in her movements. She stood on my porch with her shoulders slumped, her gaze cast downward as if she were afraid to meet my eyes. My son held her hand tightly, not in ownership, but in fear of losing her to the spiraling worry she could no longer hide. The weight of everything they had confessed lingered between us like a heavy fog, thickening the air with questions none of us knew how to voice yet. When I hugged her gently, she clung to me in a way that astonished me, a fragile grip full of apology and exhaustion and silent pleas she was too broken to articulate. It was not forgiveness she sought, it was something deeper. The kind of acceptance that only comes when the facade has cracked open completely. After they left, I walked through the rooms of my house in a slow daze, letting the quiet wrap around me like a blanket too heavy to move beneath. I stopped in front of the framed photos on my shelf, my fingers brushing over the images of my son's childhood, remembering the boy who once trusted me with every scraped knee, every nightmare, every choice that shaped him. I thought about the man he was now, carrying the burden of a wife whose mind was unraveling beneath pressures he didn't understand, pressures he wasn't prepared for, pressures he was too ashamed to seek help for. My heart ached for him with a fierce tenderness that surprised me. But beneath that tenderness, a new unease began to form. A quiet whisper in my gut, a warning. Something more was wrong, something my daughter-in-law didn't say, something my son didn't know, something neither of them could see, but I felt it. I felt it the way animals sense storms before the first cloud appears. I felt it like a vibration in the air, a shift in the energy around their home that did not come from illness or fear or exhaustion. It came from something else entirely. The next morning, the unease had not faded. It had grown roots inside me. I tried to occupy myself with my usual routines, but nothing held my attention. I kept seeing the haunted look in my daughter-in-law's eyes, the trembling in her hands, the way she flinched toward the car as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. People losing themselves mentally do not hold their bodies like that. There is fear, yes, but not this kind, not this reflexive vigilance, not this instinctive recoil. This was not a woman afraid of her own mind. This was a woman afraid of something outside her mind. I called my son in the early afternoon just to check on them, but his voice was layered with exhaustion. He said things were okay. He said she was resting. He said he was keeping an eye on everything. But his tone quivered on certain words, like he was carefully stepping around a truth he could not quite identify. I asked if the child was all right. He said yes, but the pause that followed was too long, too heavy, too careful. I asked if he was sure. He hesitated again. Then he changed the subject in a way that told me all I needed to know. Something was happening in their home, something that had nothing to do with my age, nothing to do with my daughter-in-law's trembling hands, nothing to do with the accusation they had thrown at me. Something was lurking in the spaces they refused to name. That evening, I sat on my sofa with a blanket wrapped loosely around my shoulders, watching the shadows stretch across the room as the light faded from gold to dusk. My thoughts spiraled through all the possibilities I had tried to ignore. I remembered the way my daughter-in-law's eyes darted toward the hallway when I visited months ago, the way she shut doors quietly but quickly, the way she stiffened when the baby monitor made the slightest crackle. I remembered the bruises on her arm she had brushed off as a clumsy bump against the counter. I remembered the time my grandson recoiled suddenly when she raised her hand to adjust his collar. A fear so brief and delicate, I had almost convinced myself it was imagined. And then a thought formed in the shadows of my mind, unwelcome but undeniable. What if her fear was not of herself? What if it was of someone close? Someone inside the home? Someone who had access to their routines, their vulnerabilities, their trust? The weight of that possibility pressed against my chest, stealing my breath for a moment. I stood and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street, the soft glow of porch lights flickering to life. I tried to shake the thought off. I tried to tell myself I was overstepping, worrying too much, reading too deeply. But my instincts had never failed me when it came to protecting those I loved. I believed what she had told me, but I also believed she had not told me everything. The next day confirmed it. In the late afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was not my son. It was my daughter-in-law. Her voice was hollow, thin, fractured. She asked if I could come over. Not urgently, not with panic, but with a kind of resigned tremor that made my heart drop into my stomach. I grabbed my coat and keys and left immediately, driving faster than I normally allowed myself to. Each mile between my house and theirs felt like a tightening rope pulling at my ribs. When I arrived, the house looked the same from the outside. Neat, quiet, peaceful, a lie painted in warm siding and trimmed bushes. But the moment she opened the door, I saw everything written on her face. Her eyes were swollen again, but now they carried something more than fear. They carried defeat. My son was not home. She said he had gone to run an errand. Her voice trembled when she said it. I asked where the child was. She motioned toward the living room, and then I heard it. A soft, muffled sound, a small cry. My grandson's cry. I rushed inside without hesitation, my heart pounding so violently I could feel the pulse in my fingertips. And when I entered the living room, I saw him sitting on the floor with his little hands pressed against his ears, tears streaming down his cheeks. His body shook with silent sobs. He looked up at me as if he had been waiting for me, as if some part of him recognized that safety had finally stepped into the room. I lifted him into my arms immediately, feeling the warmth of his small body trembling against mine. And in that moment, my daughter-in-law broke, completely. She collapsed into a chair and covered her face, sobbing uncontrollably. I asked her what happened. She shook her head at first. Whispered that she couldn't say, whispered that she didn't know how, whispered that she feared saying it out loud would make it real. I went to her and placed my free hand gently on her shoulder. Tell me. Her voice cracked. It's not me you should be worried about. I leaned in, then who? Her answer came out in a whisper so fragile it barely surfaced into the air. Your son. Everything inside me went still. Not with disbelief, not with denial, but with the heavy, irreversible truth that everything I had sensed, everything I had feared, everything she had tried to hide had finally come undone. And now the danger had a name. For a long moment after she whispered his name, the air inside the room thickened into something so heavy it seemed to press against my lungs, making the simple act of breathing feel difficult. My grandson's tiny fingers clung to my shirt with desperate strength, his soft hiccups vibrating against my chest as his tears slowly soaked through the fabric. My daughter-in-law sat across from me with her face buried in her hands, her shoulders trembling like someone bracing against an earthquake inside her own bones. And I stood there frozen, not because I refused to believe her, but because I had known, in that unspoken way mothers know everything they wish they didn't, that the danger in their home had a shape far closer than she had ever dared say aloud. When she finally lifted her face from her palms, the look in her eyes hollowed out something inside me. It was not the look of someone placing blame. It was the look of someone staring at a truth she no longer had the strength to outrun. I carried my grandson to the sofa and held him close, letting his trembling slow against me before turning my gaze back to her. She was shaking, her fingers twisting together as if she needed to hold her own hands still before they betrayed the fear inside her. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. She whispered again, barely louder than a breath, that it was him. My son. She said the words with a fragility that made my heart fracture, not because I doubted her, but because I could see how much she hated herself for saying them. I asked her to explain. She hesitated at first, her eyes jumping toward the window as if expecting him to walk through the door in that very instant, as if speaking the truth aloud might summon him like a storm. She swallowed hard and began in a trembling voice that carried the weight of too many nights spent holding her fear in silence, because she didn't want to tarnish his image in the eyes of the one person who loved him earliest and most. She said it started small. A snapped tone, a harsh word, subtle impatience that escalated into sudden temper. She said she had excused it all at first with the tired excuses women give themselves when they hope love will smooth sharp edges back into tenderness. Stress, work pressure, lack of sleep. She said she had told herself it was temporary. Then it grew. She said there were nights when he came home with a darkness in his eyes she didn't recognize, a tension in his jaw that didn't belong to the kind boy he had once been. She said he began losing patience with small things: a spilled drink, a misplaced toy, a question asked twice. And then one evening, she froze mid sentence because she couldn't make herself speak the memory fully. She pressed her hands against her eyes and shook her head as if she could wipe the moment away. I reached toward her gently, telling her she could tell me anything, that I wasn't here to judge or scold or turn away. She let out a trembling exhale and said he had shouted. Not at her. At the child, their 3-year-old, their son. She said the sound of it had pierced the room so sharply that even the baby monitor had crackled. She had run to pick the child up immediately, but my son had snapped again, louder this time, the kind of voice that did not belong in the throat of a father holding his own flesh and blood. She said she had never seen him like that, never imagined him capable of it. She said the anger in him felt like someone else, a stranger wearing his face. She said she had tried to calm him, but he turned that fury toward her instead, not in blows or overt violence, but in words, sharp words that cut far deeper because they came from the man she believed would never hurt her. He accused her of coddling. He accused her of making their child weak. He accused her of making him feel inadequate. She said she had stood there in the dimly lit bedroom, holding the child in her arms, while my son shouted things he didn't mean, but shouted anyway because something inside him had snapped and he didn't know how to close the fracture again. I sat silently, listening, feeling the cold edge of fear crawl slowly along my spine. I had raised him. I knew the gentle child he once was. I knew the boy who cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant, the boy who hugged me so tightly after nightmares that I could feel his heartbeat crashing against mine. I knew the young man who always helped carry groceries, who held doors open for strangers, who laughed easily and forgave quickly. But I also knew the man adulthood had shaped him into, the man who learned to hide stress behind silence, the man who carried every disappointment around like an invisible stone in his pocket, weighing him down in ways he refused to acknowledge. I knew how easily a gentle soul could break under too much pressure, and now I saw the pieces. My daughter-in-law continued in a trembling whisper, saying that the moment that broke her came only 3 days ago. She said my son had been pacing the kitchen, muttering to himself about work, about money, about everything and nothing. Their child had wandered in with a toy car and asked him a question in the innocent way toddlers do. Her voice cracked as she explained how my son hadn't even realized he was shouting until the child burst into tears and hid behind her legs. She said my son froze then, staring at his own hands as if they had betrayed him, as if he no longer trusted himself around his own child. I felt my breath leave me slowly, painfully, like something was being torn out of my chest thread by thread. She said since that night he had been distant, quiet, moving through the house like a shadow unsure of its own shape. She said he had admitted to her that something was wrong inside him, something simmering beneath the surface that he couldn't understand or control. She said he had refused to talk to anyone else about it, refused to see a professional, refused to admit he needed help because he didn't want me to know. He didn't want me to see the cracks in him. He didn't want to disappoint me. Then she said the words that made my entire world tilt. He said he didn't trust himself around the baby anymore. She began to sob again, her whole body shaking with guilt and fear and relief at finally speaking the truth aloud. I held my grandson close, gently stroking his soft hair while staring at her with a heartbreak too deep to speak. I asked her why she had never called me earlier, why she had pushed me away, why she had pretended I was the danger when the truth was so much closer, so much more terrifying. Her voice broke completely when she said she thought if she hid it long enough, he would get better. She thought if she took on everything herself, she could protect both her child and my son. She thought if she kept me away, I wouldn't see the fractures, but she was wrong. And now the cracks had spread too far to hide. She lifted her trembling gaze to me then, her eyes glassy with desperation. I'm scared of what might happen if we don't stop this. My heart clenched. I wanted to gather her into my arms, tell her she wasn't alone, tell her we would handle it together. But before I could say a word, the sound of a car engine rolled into the driveway. My daughter-in-law's entire body jolted with a sharp, instinctive panic. She stood up too quickly, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes darting toward the living room archway as if she expected him to walk through it already. I turned toward the door, my pulse pounding in my ears. The front door opened. My son stepped inside. His face was drawn, his eyes dark with exhaustion, his shoulders sagging beneath invisible weight. But when his eyes fell on the scene before him, something inside him shifted. He saw his wife with tears streaking her face. He saw his child clinging to me, his little hands gripping my shirt tightly. He saw the tension hanging in the room like a thick fog, and then his eyes met mine. Pain flashed across his face. Not anger, not defensiveness, not guilt, but something more dangerous, recognition. He knew that she had told me. He knew the truth had finally surfaced. He knew he could no longer hide. He took one slow step forward, his voice barely audible. Mom, it wasn't a greeting, it was a confession. And as that single word reverberated through the room, the moment hung suspended in the air, poised between revelation and collapse. We were no longer a family standing in the shadows of unspoken fears. We were a family standing at the edge of truth. And what came next would determine whether we broke completely or finally began to heal. When my son stepped fully into the room, the air shifted in a way that felt almost physical, like the moment before thunder breaks open the sky. His eyes moved slowly across the space, taking in every nuance, every detail, every tremor of emotion suspended in the air. He saw his wife standing rigidly near the doorway with tears drying unevenly on her cheeks. He saw our grandson pressed into my shoulder, his small body curled against me in that instinctive way children seek safety before understanding it. He saw me holding the child with arms that were more steady than my heartbeat. And then he saw the truth etched across the faces of the two women who loved him most. It was a truth he had been trying to bury, a truth he had hoped no one would name aloud, a truth so heavy it darkened his features like a shadow cast by something deep inside him. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The silence felt thick, stretching between us like an invisible barrier that all three of us feared breaking. My son's breathing grew unsteady, his chest rising and falling with a tightness that made my own lungs ache. I could see the exact moment he realized that whatever fragile veil he had been holding over his life had been torn open. The recognition in his eyes was raw and startling, the kind of recognition that only comes when someone finally sees the consequences of their own unraveling reflected back at them. He took another step forward, his hands trembling slightly at his sides, fingers curling and uncurling the way they did when he was a child trying not to cry. His voice, when he finally spoke, came out hoarse and unfamiliar, as though something was scraping its way out of his throat. How much did she tell you? His wife flinched at the sound of his words, the kind of flinch that broke something small inside me. She had loved him, she still loved him, but she had been living in fear of a part of him she could not predict, a part of him she didn't understand, a part of him that frightened her enough to hide it from the world even as it consumed her. She looked at her feet as she whispered that she had told me the truth. The fullness of it, the parts she had tried to carry alone, the parts she had thought might disappear if she just endured them quietly. My son swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and in that moment I saw the horror bloom across his face. A deep, devastating horror born not from being discovered, but from seeing the pain reflected back at him from the woman who had once trusted him with her whole heart. His knees seemed to weaken slightly, and for a moment I thought he might collapse right there in the foyer. Instead, he turned toward me, his eyes glassy with tears he refused to let fall. "Mom, I'm sorry." His voice cracked on the last word, splintering into something small and broken. He stepped closer, one unsteady foot in front of the other, until he stood only a few feet away. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes as if trying to hold himself together, but the tremble in his shoulders betrayed him. "I didn't want you to know." His words fell into the room like a confession he had been holding inside his chest until it bruised the edges of his soul. He said he had been ashamed. He said he didn't know what was happening to him. He said the anger came in waves he couldn't predict, boiling up before he had time to control it. He said he hated the sound of his own voice when it rose without warning. He said he saw fear in his child's eyes and didn't know who he had become. He said he felt like a stranger living inside his own skin. Each admission broke him further, unraveling the image he had spent years building of being steady, reliable, controlled. He looked at me again, desperation hollowing his voice. "I thought if I kept you away, I could fix it before you saw what I am turning into." My heart clenched painfully. I could see the little boy he once was standing behind the man he had become, his eyes wide and frightened, asking for help without knowing how to form the words. I stepped forward slowly, gently shifting my grandson onto my hip so that I could reach one hand toward my son. When my fingers brushed his arm, he inhaled sharply as if the touch itself cracked open the last barrier he had been clinging to. He leaned his forehead against my shoulder with a suddenness that made the world tilt, and for a moment he stood there trembling, breathing hard, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to break free from deep inside him. I will never forget the sound he made when he finally let go. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a quiet, shattered exhale, the kind that escapes a person only when the weight they have been carrying becomes too impossible to hold alone. I wrapped my free arm around him, holding my grown son the way I held him when he was a terrified little boy climbing into my bed after a nightmare. His tears soaked into my shoulder, warm and heavy, each one a confession of the pain he had hidden from all of us. His wife watched from across the room with tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling at her sides as she witnessed the man she loved break open completely. She whispered his name in a voice filled with love and fear and devastation. She said she never wanted to lose him. She said she never stopped believing he was still the gentle man she married. She said she hid the truth because she thought facing it would destroy him. She said she didn't realize how close he was to being destroyed by hiding it. I looked at both of them, my heart heavy and overflowing with a mixture of sorrow and fierce determination. This was not a home with villains. This was a home with wounded souls. A home that had been sinking quietly beneath stress and exhaustion and unspoken fear. A home where my grandson had been caught in the crossfire of emotional storms he was too young to understand. I told my son softly that loving someone does not mean we hide from our darkness. It means we walk through it together. I told him I wasn't afraid of him. I told him I had seen the best of him for decades and that the part struggling now did not erase who he truly was. I told him that facing the truth was not failure. It was courage. I told him we would help him get the support he needed, not as a burden, but as a family who refused to let him drown alone. He sank onto the sofa beside me, pressing a trembling hand against his forehead, as if trying to steady the chaos swirling inside him. My grandson curled into his lap, resting his little head against his father's chest, and the sight of it broke all three of us at once. My son held him gently, carefully, as though he feared even the weight of his own arms. Tears slipped down his cheeks and onto his child's hair. His wife sat beside him slowly, slipping her hand into his shaking one. For the first time, there was no hiding, no excuse. No misdirection, only truth. But even as I held them, even as I felt a fragile beginning forming within the ruins of their fear, I sensed another truth rising quietly inside me. A truth I had not voiced. A truth I had not allowed myself to think fully. Someone else knew he was unraveling. Someone outside this family. Someone who had seen the cracks before we did. Someone who had taken advantage of the chaos inside their home. Someone who would soon reveal themselves in the most devastating way possible. The danger was not only inside him. There was a larger threat circling their lives, waiting for the moment when all of them were too fragile to notice. And in the final chapter of this story, that danger would step fully into the light. After my son finally collapsed into silence, drained from the weight of his own confessions and the raw exhaustion of admitting every fear he had buried beneath responsibilities he was never taught to share, the house seemed to settle into a stillness so complete it felt almost sacred. My grandson had fallen asleep in his father's arms with the complete trust only a child could have, unaware of the emotional earthquake that had torn through the home. My daughter in law sat beside them, one hand on her husband's knee, her fingers trembling each time she exhaled. I sat across from them on the edge of the armchair, watching the family I loved so deeply trying to gather themselves from pieces scattered across the room. The moment should have felt like relief, like the first breath after being underwater too long. But underneath the quiet, I felt something else stirring, something sharp and cold pressing against the back of my mind, the way a mother senses danger before it has a name. It was the phone that shattered the moment. A loud vibration against the wooden coffee table, rattling a coaster and breaking the fragile calm. My son jumped slightly, his body tightening with reflexive panic, the kind that comes from days of being on the edge of yourself. He wiped his face quickly and reached for the phone, glancing at the screen. His eyes flickered, then narrowed with confusion. He frowned and muttered that it was a message from their neighbor across the street. A simple request at first glance. But his expression changed the moment he opened it fully, and I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. He stared at the screen, frozen. Then he handed me the phone with a quiet tremor in his hand. Tell her. His wife leaned forward, her face draining of what little color she still had. Her lips parted, but no words followed. Her eyes darted toward the front door, toward the hallway, toward the corners of the room where shadows pooled too deeply. Her entire body stiffened, and in that instant I understood that this was not new to her. She had been waiting for something like this, expecting it. Fear had lived inside her too long for this level of panic to come from a single message. I lowered my gaze to the phone. The message read, I thought you should know someone was walking around your backyard again last night. Same person as before. Tried the gate twice. Be careful. The words felt like a cold hand sliding down my spine. I looked at my daughter-in-law, and the truth that she had been hiding beneath all her trembling finally cracked open. She whispered that it wasn't the first time. She whispered that the neighbor had told her about the person weeks ago. Someone lurking near the fence. Someone watching the windows. Someone trying the gate latch in the early hours of the morning. She whispered that she tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was a delivery driver turning around or someone lost. But then she began finding things out of place in their yard. A garden tool moved, a toy left outside that she had put away, footprints in the damp soil near the back door, things she had blamed on herself, on her exhaustion, on her slipping memory. But she was not the one forgetting, she was the one being watched. Her voice trembled violently as she explained she had been too afraid to tell my son. She didn't want to add fear to the anger he was already fighting. She didn't want him to think he was losing control of everything. She chose silence, believing that hiding the truth would protect him. But her silence invited danger to grow roots. I listened, clutching my sleeping grandson closer, feeling the slow rise and fall of his breath against my neck, grounding me in the middle of the fear swirling through the room. My son ran both hands through his hair, gripping his scalp as if trying to force clarity into a mind crowded with too many truths at once. He whispered that he had heard noises outside 2 nights ago, but brushed them off because he thought he was imagining things, thought his own unraveling mind was betraying him. But now he understood. The danger was real, and they had all been looking in the wrong direction. I stood slowly, my knees trembling with the weight of understanding. I walked toward the back of the house, moving as quietly as possible so as not to wake the child. My daughter-in-law rushed after me, begging me not to go near the window. But some force inside me stronger than fear pulled me forward. I needed to see, I needed to understand. The hallway felt too long, the air too still, the shadows too sharp. When I reached the back door, I froze. The curtain beside the glass was slightly pushed aside. Not the way one brushes past it accidentally. The way someone peeks through it from the outside. My breath hitched painfully. A coldness washed through me as I leaned closer, slowly lifting the fabric. Outside, the yard looked undisturbed on the surface. But near the gate, shapes in the dirt told a different story. A pattern of fresh footprints. Not mine, not theirs, not random, deliberate, two sets, one leading toward the gate, one leading away. And the gate latch hung slightly crooked, as if someone had tried to force it open during the night. My daughter-in-law grabbed my arm with a sharp gasp, pulling me backward as if the darkness outside might reach in and snatch us. I shut the curtain quickly, a tightness forming in my chest so fierce I had to grip the counter to steady myself. My son appeared beside us a moment later, pale and shaking, his breathing ragged, his eyes darting like he was scanning every shadow for movement. He whispered that the front yard had security cameras, but the backyard didn't. He whispered that it was the one blind spot around the house. He whispered that he had been meaning to install more cameras for months, but kept putting it off because he was sinking under the weight of managing everything else. His wife sank onto a chair, pressing both hands to her mouth to muffle a sob. She whispered that the person outside had been watching them, watching their child, watching her walk room to room, watching my son unravel. And then she said the part that made every muscle in my body go rigid. They weren't trying the gate at random. They were testing to see when the child was outside. She choked on her own breath as she said she had always locked the gate carefully, but some mornings she found it less secure than she remembered. She said she blamed exhaustion. She said she blamed her mind. She said she blamed herself for forgetting, but she had not forgotten. Someone else had been there. Someone had been slipping inside the yard. Someone had been watching the moments her son played with his toys near the back fence. Someone had been waiting for the moment she let down her guard. My legs nearly gave out when I realized the true danger had been circling them quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, while they wasted time accusing me of being untrustworthy. The humiliation I had felt a week earlier now twisted into something far more devastating. They had feared the wrong person, distrusted the wrong person, guarded their child from the wrong person, and now the truth was staring us all in the face. The phone buzzed again. A second message from the neighbor. He is back, right now. Saw movement behind your shed. My daughter-in-law screamed before she could stop herself. My son grabbed the child from my arms, clutching him so tightly the little boy woke with a frightened cry. I pushed them all into the hallway, away from the windows, my heart pounding hard enough to rattle my chest. My son fumbled with his phone, calling the police with shaking fingers, shouting into the receiver that someone was on his property, that his family was at risk, that they needed help immediately. But even as he gave their address, even as his voice broke, even as his wife held her child and sobbed against the wall, I felt something heavier settle inside me. A presence. A shadow moving outside. A quiet scrape against the siding. A footstep far too light for an animal. The house fell silent except for our breathing. Then a slow creak by the back porch made my blood run cold. Before I could think, before fear could paralyze me, I acted. I grabbed the heaviest object near me, a thick metal floor lamp, and positioned myself between the hallway and the back rooms, standing as the barrier between my family and whatever waited outside. My daughter-in-law stared at me in shock, tears streaming down her face as she whispered that I was too old to fight someone. I stared straight ahead, gripping the lamp tightly. I am old, yes, but I gave birth to the man you love. And I will protect his child with everything I have left. The room trembled with tension. Then the sound of sirens in the distance pierced the silence. My son shouted through the hallway that help was coming. My daughter-in-law clung to my grandson and prayed under her breath. The footsteps outside grew quicker, then faded suddenly as the intruder fled. The sirens grew louder until red and blue flashed across the windows. Officers swarmed the property, voices echoing through the yard as they chased the shadow disappearing into the darkness. An officer banged on the front door, shouting for us to open it. My son rushed to unlock it, his hands still shaking. They were safe. We were safe, but everything had changed. In the hours that followed, police searched the property, documenting footprints matching the pattern the neighbor had described earlier in the week. They told us someone had likely been watching the house for some time, searching for the moment the yard was unattended or the child was unsupervised. They told us the intruder had likely planned to return until he found the perfect opportunity. They told us that whoever it was had left behind something near the shed that suggested he had been very close to acting on whatever plan he had. When the officers finally left, when the house was quiet again, when my son locked every door twice and installed temporary alarms on every window, they all came to me. My daughter in law fell to her knees in front of me, grabbing my hands in both of hers with a desperation that made my chest ache. She sobbed that she was wrong. She sobbed that she had misjudged me. She sobbed that she had turned her fear inward and cast suspicion on the only person who had been trying to protect them. She sobbed that she had pushed me away when she needed me most. My son stood beside her, his face red with shame. He whispered that he had let his own unraveling cloud his judgment. He whispered that he had allowed fear, pride, exhaustion, and panic to distort his perception of the one person who had always loved him unconditionally. He whispered that he should have trusted me. He whispered that he was sorry, truly, deeply sorry. I pulled both of them up and wrapped my arms around them, my grandson pressed between us, his little head resting against my collarbone. And in that moment, in the stillness of a home that had nearly become the site of tragedy, I felt something settle inside me. Not pride, not triumph, not vindication, something quieter, something deeper. Belonging, not the belonging of being needed, not the belonging of being useful, but the belonging of being trusted again. Seen again, loved again, for so long they had doubted my steadiness, my memory, my age, my ability to protect. But tonight, when danger crept close enough to touch the walls of their home, I had stood between that danger and the people I loved. And in doing so, they finally saw me clearly. Not as the aging mother they worried was slipping. Not as the fragile grandmother they feared would forget. Not as the burden they had convinced themselves I had become. They saw me as I truly was, their anchor, their protector, their family. In the days that followed, my son sought help for his anger and exhaustion. He began therapy with a gentleness toward himself he had never practiced before. My daughter in law dissolved her silence and began speaking honestly without fear of judgment. And they both asked me to watch their child again, not out of convenience, out of trust. And when my grandson reached for me with a bright smile, when he curled into my lap with the ease of pure safety, when he looked at me with unguarded love, I felt something inside me bloom again. I was not too old. I was not untrustworthy. I was exactly the person they needed. And 1 week after they pushed me away, life had taught them the lesson they never expected. They should have been worried about the danger outside their home, not the grandmother inside it. If this story touched you, follow the channel for more powerful, raw, heart-shaking stories every week. I write about family, sacrifice, betrayal, healing, motherhood, and the moments that change everything. Follow now so you never miss the next story that breaks your heart and puts it back together. Like, share, and comment to support the channel and help these emotional stories reach more people. Turn on notifications so you're always first to read what comes next. Your support keeps these stories alive. Stay with the channel, more unforgettable stories are on the way.